The dust on Tabitha Russell's wedding dress had turned from white to rust-colored as she climbed through the bedroom window of her husband's house, clutching nothing but a small leather satchel and the certainty that she would rather die in the desert than spend another night under that roof. She had been wife number 4 for exactly 3 weeks, and in that time she had learned that Samuel Pritchard's promises of devotion were divided among so many women that each received only scraps of affection, and Tabitha refused to live on scraps. The Arizona night stretched before her as she ran, her boots hitting the packed earth in rhythm with her racing heart. Behind her, the compound where Samuel kept his 4 wives sat like a monument to his greed, and Tabitha did not look back. She was 21 years old, and 3 weeks ago she had believed the silver-tongued rancher when he said she would want for nothing. He had not lied exactly, but he had failed to mention that nothing included love, privacy, and dignity. The other wives had watched her with pity in their eyes, and that pity had burned worse than any anger could have. Tabitha ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, following the road south toward Bisbee. She had heard the mining town was rough but fair, a place where a woman might find work if she was willing to try. The alternative was returning to her father's farm in Texas, where he would surely send her right back to Samuel, having already spent the bride price. So Tabitha ran toward the unknown, and she did not stop until the first light of dawn painted the sky pink and gold. She reached Bisbee as the town was waking, miners heading to their shifts and shopkeepers opening their doors. Tabitha's fine wedding dress was ruined beyond repair, and she must have looked like a ghost or a madwoman stumbling down the main street. Several people stared, but no one stopped her until she reached the door of a boarding house and nearly collapsed against it. The woman who answered was stout and gray-haired with eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Tabitha and pulled her inside without a word. "Sit," the woman commanded, pointing to a chair in the small front room. "I will get you water." Tabitha sat because her legs would no longer hold her. The woman returned with water and bread, and Tabitha drank and ate like someone starving. "Thank you," she managed between bites. "I am Mrs. Chen," the woman said. "You are running from something." It was not a question, but Tabitha answered anyway. "From someone, my husband. He has 3 other wives, and I cannot live that way." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "You are brave to run. Many women stay." "I could not stay," Tabitha said simply. "I would have died there, maybe not in body, but in spirit." "You need work," Mrs. Chen said. "You need a new dress. You need to disappear for a while, yes." Tabitha met the older woman's eyes and saw understanding there. "Yes to all of that." Mrs. Chen smiled slightly. "I need help here at the boarding house. The work is hard, but you will have a room and meals. You will also need a story, in case your husband comes looking." Over the next hour, Mrs. Chen helped Tabitha transform. The ruined wedding dress went into the stove, and Tabitha dressed in a simple cotton dress and apron. Mrs. Chen cut her long blonde hair to her shoulders, changing her appearance enough that a casual observer might not recognize her. They agreed that Tabitha would use her mother's maiden name, Reeves, and that she had come from Tucson looking for work after her family died of fever. The lie tasted bitter, but Tabitha swallowed it along with her fear. She had made her choice, and now she would live with the consequences. The boarding house catered mostly to miners and cowboys passing through Bisbee, and the work was indeed hard. Tabitha washed sheets and cooked meals and scrubbed floors until her hands were raw. But she also laughed with Mrs. Chen, listened to the stories of the boarders, and felt something inside her slowly come back to life. This was not the future she had imagined for herself, but it was honest work, and she was beholden to no man. 3 weeks after Tabitha arrived in Bisbee, A cowboy named Preston Nash rode into town with a string of horses he was delivering to a ranch outside of town. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and gray eyes that seemed to see more than most people. He took a room at Mrs. Chen's boarding house and paid for a week in advance, saying he needed to rest his animals before heading back to New Mexico. Tabitha brought him supper that first evening, a plate of beef and beans and fresh bread. Preston stood when she entered, tipping his hat with an old-fashioned courtesy that made her pause. "Madam," he said, "thank you kindly." "You are welcome," Tabitha replied, setting the plate on the small table. She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "I do not mean to be forward, but you look like someone who has not been in Bisbee very long." Tabitha stiffened, fear racing down her spine. "What makes you say that?" Preston held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I am not asking questions I should not. You just have that look about you, like you are still deciding if you made the right choice coming here." Something in his tone made Tabitha relax slightly. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who has worn that same look," Preston said quietly. "I left home when I was 17, and I spent a long time wondering if I had made the right choice. Eventually, I realized that the right choice is the one you can live with, not the one that makes everyone else happy." Tabitha found herself sitting down across from him without quite meaning to. "Why did you leave?" Preston picked up his fork but did not eat yet. "My father wanted me to take over the family business. He was a lawyer, and he had my whole life planned out for me. But I could not spend my days in an office, arguing over papers and land rights. I needed to be outside, working with my hands and my horse, so I left and he disowned me, and I have been a cowboy ever since." "You regret it?" Tabitha asked. "Some days," Preston admitted, "but mostly no. I am living the life I chose, not the life someone else chose for me. That has to count for something." Tabitha felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back quickly. "Yes, it does count for something." Preston studied her for a long moment, and Tabitha had the strange feeling that he understood exactly what she was not saying. But he simply nodded and began to eat, and Tabitha excused herself to return to the kitchen. Over the next few days, Tabitha found herself watching for Preston. He was different from the other boarders, quieter and more thoughtful. He helped Mrs. Chen carry heavy loads without being asked, and he always thanked Tabitha for the meals she brought him. On the third day of his stay, he asked if she would like to take a walk when her work was done. Tabitha hesitated, remembering Samuel's smooth words and easy promises. But there was something genuine in Preston's gray eyes, something that made her want to trust him. "I finish at 6, she heard herself say. "I will wait for you on the porch," Preston replied. That evening, they walked through Bisbee as the sun set, painting the desert hills in shades of purple and gold. Preston asked her questions about where she had come from, and Tabitha gave him the story she and Mrs. Chen had created. She hated lying to him, but the truth was too dangerous to share with someone she barely knew. Preston told her about his work, how he had spent the last 8 years moving from ranch to ranch, breaking horses and driving cattle. "It is a lonely life sometimes," he admitted, "but it is mine." "Do you ever think about settling down?" Tabitha asked. Preston was quiet for a moment. "I used to think I would when I was older, but now I am 28 and still moving. I suppose I have not found a reason to stay in one place yet." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, and Tabitha realized she felt safer with this near stranger than she had felt in weeks. There was no pressure in Preston's presence, no expectations or demands. He simply walked beside her, content with the quiet and the cooling evening air. When they returned to the boarding house, Preston said, "I would like to do this again tomorrow if you are willing." Tabitha smiled, the expression feeling strange and wonderful on her face. "I would like that too." Over the next several days, Tabitha and Preston fell into a pattern. She would work during the day, and he would tend to his horses or help with repairs around the boarding house. In the evenings, they would walk and talk, sharing pieces of themselves carefully, like precious things that might break if handled roughly. Preston told her about growing up in Philadelphia, about the suffocating expectations of his family's society friends, about the first time he had ridden a horse across open land and felt truly free. Tabitha told him about growing up on a farm in Texas, about her mother who had died when she was 16, about her love of reading and her dreams of seeing the ocean someday. She did not tell him about Samuel or the 3 other wives or the desperate flight through the desert. That truth lodged in her throat every time she thought about sharing it, and she swallowed it back down. On Preston's last night in Bisbee, he asked Tabitha to have dinner with him at the hotel restaurant. She agreed, borrowing a nicer dress from Mrs. Chen and pinning her hair up carefully. When Preston saw her, something shifted in his eyes, something warm and wondering that made Tabitha's breath catch. They ate roast chicken and potatoes, and they talked about everything and nothing, and when the meal was over, Preston walked her back to the boarding house slowly, as if trying to make the night last longer. On the porch, he turned to face her, his hat in his hands. "Tabitha," he said, and her name sounded like something precious in his voice. "I have to leave tomorrow, but I do not want to. These past days with you have been the best I have had in longer than I can remember." Tabitha's heart hammered in her chest. "I have felt the same way." Preston stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "I know you are running from something. I do not know what, and I will not ask if you do not want to tell me. But I want you to know that whatever it is, it does not matter to me. What matters is the woman you are now, the one I have come to care for." Tears spilled down Tabitha's cheeks before she could stop them. "Preston, You do not have to say anything," Preston interrupted gently. "I just need you to know that if you ever need help, or if you ever want to leave Bisbee, I will come for you. I am working at the Double N Ranch outside of Lordsburg, New Mexico. You can send word to me there." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. It had the ranch's name and location written in careful script. Tabitha clutched it like a lifeline. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Preston reached up and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. "Because in 8 years of drifting, I have never met anyone who made me want to stay. And because I see the fear in your eyes and I want to be the reason it goes away." He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, and kissed her forehead softly. "Think about it," he murmured. "I will wait for you as long as it takes." Then he was gone, disappearing into the boarding house, and Tabitha stood on the porch clutching his address and crying silent tears that were equal parts grief and hope. Preston left the next morning before dawn, and Tabitha watched from her window as he rode out of town with his string of horses trailing behind him. She pressed her hand against the glass and whispered, "Be safe." Life returned to its routine after Preston left, but everything felt different now. Tabitha went through her days mechanically, working hard and keeping her head down, but her mind was always elsewhere. She thought about Preston's gray eyes and gentle voice, about the way he had offered her escape without demanding anything in return. She also thought about Samuel, and she wondered how long it would be before he came looking for her. The answer came 6 weeks after Preston's departure. Tabitha was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house when Mrs. Chen appeared at the back door, her face grim. "A man is here asking questions," she said quietly. "He says he is looking for his wife, and he describes someone who could be you." Tabitha's blood turned to ice. "Is he inside?" "No, he is at the sheriff's office, but he will come here eventually." Everyone knows this is the only boarding house that takes in women alone. Tabitha's hands shook as she unpinned the last sheet. I have to leave. Yes, Mrs. Chen agreed, and quickly, pack your things. I will give you food and money. 20 minutes later, Tabitha was ready to run again. Mrs. Chen pressed a bundle of food and a small bag of coins into her hands. Go to your cowboy, the older woman said firmly. He will protect you. How did you know? Tabitha asked, surprised. Mrs. Chen smiled slightly. I have eyes. And I know the look of two people falling in love even if they do not know it themselves yet. Now go out the back way. Head east toward Lordsburg. Tabitha hugged Mrs. Chen tightly. Thank you for everything. Live well, Mrs. Chen replied. That is thanks enough. Tabitha slipped out the back door and into the desert, heading east toward New Mexico and toward Preston. She had no horse and no clear plan beyond reaching the Double N Ranch, but she had hope, and that was something. The journey to Lordsburg was brutal. Tabitha walked during the cooler morning and evening hours and rested during the hottest part of the day, sheltering under rocky outcrops and drinking sparingly from the canteen Mrs. Chen had given her. She followed the road when she could see it and navigated by the sun and stars when she could not. Her feet blistered and bled, her face burned despite the bonnet she wore, and she ran out of food on the third day. On the fourth day, she began to wonder if she would make it. Her water was nearly gone, and the landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. She had seen no one since leaving Bisbee, and she began to fear that she had gone the wrong direction. But on the fifth day, as the sun climbed toward its peak, and Tabitha stumbled along the road with exhaustion pulling at every step, she heard the sound of hoofbeats. She turned, shading her eyes, and saw a rider approaching fast. For a moment, fear seized her. What if Samuel had found her? But then the rider came close enough for her to see his face, and her knees buckled with relief. Preston leaped from his horse before it had fully stopped and caught Tabitha as she fell. I have got you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I have got you. Tabitha clung to him, too exhausted and relieved to speak. Preston carried her to his horse and lifted her into the saddle, then swung up behind her and wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady. Drink this slowly, he instructed, offering her his canteen. Tabitha drank, the water tasting like salvation. How did you find me? She finally managed to ask. A Chinese woman sent word to the ranch 3 days ago, Preston explained. She said you were coming and that you might need help. I have been riding out to meet you every day since. Mrs. Chen, Tabitha whispered. She saved my life. She is not the only one, Preston said grimly. What happened, Tabitha? What are you running from? As they rode toward Lordsburg, Tabitha finally told him the truth. She told him about Samuel and the 3 other wives, about the compound and the suffocating reality of plural marriage, about climbing out the window in her wedding dress and running into the night. She told him about the lie she had lived in Bisbee and about Samuel coming to find her. Preston listened without interrupting, his arm tightening around her waist as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Did you ever love him? No, Tabitha said honestly. I was foolish and naive, and I believed his lies about security and comfort. But I never loved him. Good, Preston said, because I am going to marry you if you will have me, and you are going to be my one and only wife for the rest of our lives. Tabitha twisted in the saddle to look at him, hardly daring to believe what she had heard. Preston, you do not have to do that. You do not owe me anything. Preston's gray eyes met hers, intense and certain. I am not offering out of obligation. I am offering because I fell in love with you during those walks in Bisbee, and because the past 6 weeks without you have been hell. I am offering because when Mrs. Chen's message came, I realized I would ride through fire to keep you safe. You can say no, and I will still protect you and help you. But if you say yes, I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." Tabitha's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Preston kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Tabitha kissed him back and felt the last of her fear begin to melt away. They reached the Double N Ranch by evening, and Preston introduced Tabitha to the ranch owner, a weathered man named Tom Dalton. Tom listened to their story with a serious expression, then nodded. "Preston is one of the best men I have ever employed," he said. "And if he vouches for you, that is good enough for me. You can stay in the guest room in the main house until you two get married." Tom's wife, Martha, was a kind woman in her 50s who immediately took Tabitha under her wing. She brought her fresh clothes and hot food and drew her a bath, clucking over her blistered feet and sunburned face. "You poor dear," she said, "what you have been through, but you are safe now and Preston will take good care of you." Over the next week, Tabitha rested and recovered while Preston worked on the ranch. But every evening, he would come to the main house and they would sit on the porch together, talking and planning their future. Preston was adamant that they should marry quickly, both to protect Tabitha legally and because he simply could not wait any longer. "What if Samuel comes here?" Tabitha asked one evening, voicing the fear that still haunted her. Preston took her hand, his grip strong and reassuring. "Then I will deal with him. You are not property, Tabitha. You are a person and you have the right to choose your own life. Any judge would agree that a marriage entered under false pretenses is not valid." "But what if they do not see it that way?" Tabitha pressed. Preston was quiet for a moment. "Then we will leave. We will go somewhere he can never find us. I meant what I said. You will be my one and only, and I will protect you no matter what it takes." They were married 2 weeks later by a traveling preacher who passed through Lordsburg. It was a simple ceremony in the ranch house parlor, with Tom and Martha as witnesses. Tabitha wore a blue dress that Martha had altered to fit her, and Preston wore his best shirt and vest. When the preacher asked if they took each other as husband and wife, they both said, "I do," with voices that rang clear and certain. Preston kissed his bride, and Tabitha wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, feeling truly married for the first time in her life. This was what it was supposed to feel like, this joy and certainty, an overwhelming sense of rightness. Tom had given them a small cabin on the edge of the ranch property as a wedding gift, and that night, Preston carried Tabitha over the threshold. The cabin was simple but clean, with a bed and a table and a stove, and it was theirs. Preston set Tabitha down gently and cupped her face in his hands. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "I am happier than I have ever been," Tabitha replied truthfully. Preston smiled, and it transformed his serious face into something beautiful. "Good, because I plan to spend the rest of my life keeping you that way." He kissed her again, slow and deep, and Tabitha melted into him. They made love that night with tenderness and passion, and Tabitha finally understood what it meant to be cherished by someone who loved only her. The next morning, Tabitha woke to find Preston already up and making coffee. He brought her a cup in bed and sat beside her, his hand resting on her hip. "I have been thinking," he said. "I want to buy us some land eventually, build us a proper ranch. Would you like that?" Tabitha sat up, holding the warm cup between her hands. "I would like that very much. But Preston, I do not need grand things, I just need you." "I know," Preston said, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "But I want to build a life with you, a real life with a home and maybe children someday. I want to give you everything you deserve." Tabitha set down her coffee and pulled Preston close. "You already have." Life on the Double N Ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Tabitha helped Martha with the household work and learned to tend the kitchen garden. Preston worked with the horses and cattle, his skills making him invaluable to Tom. In the evenings, they would return to their little cabin and cook dinner together, talking about their days and making plans for the future. 3 months after their wedding, a stranger rode onto the ranch. Tabitha was hanging laundry when she saw him approach the main house, and her heart stopped. Even from a distance, she recognized Samuel Pritchard's imposing figure and black horse. She dropped the laundry basket and ran to find Preston, who was in the barn shoeing a horse. "He is here," she gasped. "Samuel is here." Preston's face hardened, and he set down his tools immediately. "Stay in the cabin," he commanded. "Lock the door and do not come out until I come for you." "Preston, be careful," Tabitha pleaded. He kissed her quickly. "I will be fine. Trust me." Tabitha ran to the cabin and locked herself inside, her heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy. She peeked through the window and saw Preston walking toward the main house, his stride confident and purposeful. Tom had come out onto the porch, and Samuel was still on his horse, looking around with the arrogance of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. Preston stopped at the base of the porch steps, and though Tabitha could not hear what was being said, she could see the tension in every line of his body. The conversation went on for several minutes, with Tom occasionally interjecting something. Samuel's face grew red, and he gestured angrily. Preston remained calm, his arms crossed over his chest. Finally, Tom said something that made Samuel wheel his horse around. He rode past Preston, leaning down to say something. Preston's hand moved to the gun at his hip, and Samuel spurred his horse and galloped away. Tabitha nearly collapsed with relief. Minutes later, Preston appeared at the cabin door and she unlocked it with shaking hands. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "He is gone," Preston said, "and he is not coming back." "What did you say to him?" Tabitha asked. Preston guided her to sit at the table and took the chair beside her. "I told him that you were my legal wife and that he had no claim on you. He argued that his marriage came first, but Tom backed me up and said that any marriage involving multiple wives is not recognized by the territory of New Mexico. Samuel threatened to take it to a judge, and I told him that if he did, I would make sure everyone knew what he was doing. Most people might look the other way at plural marriage, but they do not like a man who comes hunting a woman who ran from him. It makes him look like a tyrant." "What did he say when he rode past you?" Tabitha asked, remembering that tense moment. Preston's jaw tightened. "He said I could have you, that you were more trouble than you were worth. I told him if I ever saw him again, I would not be as cordial." Tabitha shuddered. "Do you really think he will stay away?" "Yes," Preston said firmly. "Men like Samuel care more about their pride than about any individual woman. He has 3 other wives to console him, and coming after you would require him to admit that he lost. He will not do that." Over the following weeks, Tabitha gradually relaxed, and life returned to normal. Samuel did not reappear, and as the months passed, the fear that had lived in Tabitha's chest since she first ran away finally began to dissolve. A year after their wedding, Tabitha discovered she was pregnant. She told Preston one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he let out a whoop of joy and spun her around until she was laughing and dizzy. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Our baby." "Yes," Tabitha said, her own joy matching his. "Are you happy?" Preston set her down gently and knelt before her, pressing his ear to her still flat stomach. "I am the happiest man alive," he said. "And this child is going to be so loved, so incredibly loved." Tabitha ran her fingers through his dark hair and felt tears slip down her cheeks. She thought about the life she had run from, about the compound with the 4 wives and the man who thought women were possessions. Then she looked at Preston, at his hands resting gently on her waist and his eyes shining with love, and she knew she had made the right choice. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, a healthy baby with a strong cry in his father's gray eyes. They named him James Thomas Nash, and Preston cried when he held his son for the first time. "I am going to be a better father than mine was," he vowed. "I am going to let him choose his own path." Tabitha smiled through her exhaustion. "I know you will." Martha helped care for Tabitha and the baby in those first difficult weeks, and Tom gave Preston extra time off to be with his new family. The little cabin filled with the sounds of baby cries and lullabies, and Tabitha marveled at how much her life had changed in just 2 years. When James was 6 months old, Preston came home one evening with news. "Tom wants to sell me a section of land at the south edge of the ranch," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "He is getting older and wants to scale back his operation. If we can come up with the money, we could start our own place." Tabitha and Preston spent the next several months saving every penny they could. Tabitha took in sewing and laundry work, and Preston worked extra hours breaking horses. Tom gave them a generous price on the land, and by the time James turned 1, they had saved enough to make the purchase. They spent the next year building their ranch. Preston and some of the other cowboys from the Double N helped construct a small house, a barn, and corrals. Tabitha planted a garden and chickens, and they bought a small herd of cattle with money borrowed from Tom. It was hard work, the kind that left them both exhausted every night, but it was their work, their land, their future. They named their ranch the Lone Star, a nod to Tabitha's Texas roots and a reminder of how far they had come. On the day they moved into the house, Preston carried Tabitha over the threshold just as he had on their wedding night. "Welcome home, Mrs. Nash," he said. Tabitha looked around at the home they had built together, at the son playing on the floor, at the man who had promised she would be his one and only and had kept that promise every single day. "I am home," she said. "Finally and truly home." The years passed peacefully. The Lone Star Ranch grew slowly but steadily, and Preston earned a reputation as an honest rancher and a skilled horseman. Tabitha became known for her kindness and her excellent cooking, and their home was always open to neighbors in need. When James was 4, Tabitha gave birth to twin daughters, Emma and Grace. Preston was beside himself with joy, declaring that he was now the luckiest man in New Mexico. He was a devoted father, teaching James to ride and gentling the horses specially for the girls when they were old enough. He never raised his voice in anger or his hand in violence, and his children adored him. Tabitha sometimes thought about the other life she might have lived if she had not climbed out that window. She might have stayed with Samuel, might have become bitter and resigned like the other wives. She would never have known what it felt like to be truly loved, to be someone's one and only. One evening, when they had been married for 10 years, Tabitha and Preston sat on the porch of their house, watching their children play in the yard. James was 12 now, tall and responsible, helping his father with the ranch work. The twins were 6, wild and energetic, chasing each other around the yard with shrieks of laughter. "You ever regret it?" Tabitha asked suddenly. "Giving up your drifting life for all this?" Preston turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft. "Not for one single second. You and the children are everything I never knew I wanted. I spent years looking for something without knowing what it was, and then I found you, and suddenly everything made sense." Tabitha leaned her head on his shoulder. "I feel the same way. Sometimes I cannot believe this is my life." Preston put his arm around her and pulled her close. "Believe it. You earned every bit of this happiness, and I am going to make sure you keep it for the rest of our lives." As the sun set over the New Mexico landscape, painting everything in gold and amber. Tabitha closed her eyes and breathed in deeply. She could smell the desert sage and the horses in the barn and the faint scent of Preston's soap. She could hear her children laughing and the cattle lowing in the distance and the soft sound of Preston's breathing beside her. This was peace. This was love. This was home. Years continued to flow like water in the desert, precious and life-giving. James grew into a fine young man who inherited his father's way with horses and his mother's compassionate heart. At 18, he took a job at a ranch further north, writing letters home filled with stories and affection. The twins grew into beautiful young women, different as night and day but equally beloved. Emma was quiet and thoughtful, preferring books to people, while Grace was bold and adventurous, always ready for the next challenge. Tabitha and Preston grew older together, their hair graying and their hands weathering, but their love never dimmed. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming something solid and unshakable. They had built something real together, something that would outlast them both. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Preston surprised Tabitha with a trip to California. They left the ranch in James's capable hands and took the train west, finally fulfilling Tabitha's childhood dream of seeing the ocean. When they stood on the beach at sunset, with the waves crashing before them and the salt air in their lungs, Tabitha cried. "Why are you crying?" Preston asked, concerned. "Because I am so happy," Tabitha said, laughing through her tears. "Because 20 years ago I was running through the desert thinking I might die, and now I am here with you, and I have everything I ever wanted." Preston pulled her into his arms and kissed her, right there on the beach with the ocean as their witness. "You were brave enough to run," he murmured against her lips, "and I was lucky enough to catch you." They returned to New Mexico renewed, ready for whatever years remained to them. The ranch continued to thrive, and they watched with pride as their children made their own choices and followed their own paths. James eventually married a schoolteacher from Lordsburg, and they gave Tabitha and Preston their first grandchild. Emma became a teacher herself, moving to Santa Fe but visiting often. Grace shocked everyone by becoming a rancher in her own right, buying land adjacent to the Lone Star and running cattle with the same determination she brought to everything. Tabitha often thought about Mrs. Chen, who had saved her life twice over. She wrote letters to Bisbee, trying to find the woman who had shown her such kindness, but she never received a reply. Still, Tabitha honored Mrs. Chen's memory by helping other women when she could, offering employment and sanctuary to those who needed it. One such woman was a young girl named Sarah who appeared at their door in 1895, frightened and alone, running from a father who had tried to sell her to a saloon owner. Tabitha took her in without hesitation, and Preston backed her decision completely. Sarah lived with them for 2 years, healing and learning, and when she left it was to marry a kind young rancher who loved her dearly. "You saved my life," Sarah told Tabitha on her wedding day, "just like someone saved yours." Tabitha hugged the girl tightly. "We save each other," she said. "That is what women do." As Tabitha entered her 50s, she sometimes felt the weight of all she had survived and built. Her body was not as strong as it had been, and her hands ached on cold mornings. But when Preston held her at night, his arms still made her feel safe and cherished. When her children and grandchildren visited, filling the house with noise and laughter, she felt rich beyond measure. One evening, sitting on their porch as they had done countless times before, Preston took Tabitha's hand and said, "Tell me honestly, if you could go back and do it all differently, would you?" Tabitha did not even have to think about it. Not a single thing. "Every choice, every hardship, every moment of fear led me to you and to this life. I would do it all again exactly the same way." Preston brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Tabitha Nash. I have loved you since the moment you walked into my room in that boarding house with a plate of supper and sadness in your eyes. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Tabitha replied, her voice thick with emotion. "My cowboy, my husband, my one and only." They sat together as the stars came out, one by one, lighting up the vast New Mexico sky. The ranch was quiet around them, peaceful and prosperous. In the distance, they could hear the cattle and the horses, the sounds of the life they had built together from nothing but determination and love. Tabitha thought about the girl she had been at 21, climbing out a window in a ruined wedding dress, terrified but determined to be free. She thought about the long walk through the desert, about the kindness of strangers, about the cowboy who had promised she would be his one and only. She thought about all the years since, the struggles and the triumphs, the children and the grandchildren, the ordinary miracles of a life well lived. She had run from a marriage with too many wives, and she had found a marriage with perfect love. She had fled from captivity and found freedom. She had been lost and then found, broken and then healed, alone and then beloved. As Preston held her close and the night deepened around them, Tabitha sent a silent prayer of thanks to the universe, to God, to whatever forces had conspired to bring her to this moment. She had gambled everything on her own worth, on her right to choose her own path, and she had won. Years later, when Tabitha and Preston were both old and gray, they would sit on their porch and tell their grandchildren the story of how they met. The children would listen wide-eyed to tales of running through the desert, of brave cowboy rescues, of true love conquering all obstacles. They would ask questions, and Tabitha would answer honestly, never shying away from the hard parts because the hard parts made the happy ending mean something. "Was it scary, Grandma?" one grandchild would ask. "Running away like that?" "It was terrifying," Tabitha would answer. "But staying would have been worse. Sometimes the scariest choice is the right one." "How did you know Grandpa was different?" another would ask. Tabitha would look at Preston, still handsome to her even with his weathered face and silver hair, and smile. "He saw me as a person, not a possession. He offered me choice, not demands. He promised I would be his one and only, and he kept that promise every single day." Preston would squeeze her hand, and the grandchildren would sigh, satisfied with the romance of it all. The Lone Star Ranch stood for generations after Tabitha and Preston were gone, a testament to what they had built together. Their children kept it running, and their grandchildren after them, and always there were stories told of the couple who had founded it. The woman who had been brave enough to run, and the cowboy who had sworn she would be his one and only. In the end, that is what mattered most. Not the land or the cattle or the house, but the love that had made it all possible. The love that had started with walks through Bisbee at sunset and had lasted through decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. The love that had made Tabitha feel, for the first time in her life, that she was exactly where she belonged. She had been someone's fourth wife, unwanted and unvalued. But then she became Preston Nash's one and only, cherished and adored. And that made all the difference in the world. As Tabitha and Preston grew truly old into their 70s, they slowed down considerably but never lost the connection that had sustained them through everything. They would sit together for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, always holding hands. Their children and grandchildren would visit often, bringing the noise and chaos of family, and then leave them to their peaceful twilight years. On a cool spring evening in 1910, when Tabitha was 73 and Preston was 76, they sat on their porch watching the sunset as they had done thousands of times before. Preston had been feeling weak lately, and Tabitha knew in her heart that their time together was drawing to a close. But she was not afraid. They had been blessed with more years than most, and every one of those years had been worth living. "No regrets," Preston said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "No regrets," Tabitha agreed, leaning into his warmth. Preston was quiet for a moment, then said, "Promise me something. When I am gone, promise me you will not stop living. You will keep the ranch going, keep seeing the grandchildren, keep being the remarkable woman you have always been." Tabitha's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I promise." "But only if you promise the same if I go first." "Deal," Preston said, and they shook hands solemnly, then laughed at their own seriousness. Preston passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 months later with Tabitha holding his hand. She grieved deeply, but without bitterness, knowing that she had been given a gift that many people never received: a true and lasting love. She kept her promise to him, continuing to run the ranch with the help of her children, continuing to see the grandchildren who brought light into her days. Tabitha lived another 7 years, and in that time she wrote down her story. She wanted her grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know where they came from, to understand the price of freedom and the value of love. She wrote about Samuel and the 3 other wives, about climbing out the window and running through the desert. She wrote about Mrs. Chen and the boarding house in Bisbee, about Preston walking into her life and changing everything. Most of all, she wrote about love, real love, the kind that sees you as you are and cherishes you anyway. The kind that promises you will be the one and only and means it with every breath. The kind that builds homes and raises children and weathers storms and stands firm when everything else falls away. When Tabitha died in 1917 at the age of 80, she was surrounded by family and filled with peace. Her last words were, "Tell Preston I am coming home." They buried her next to Preston on a hill overlooking the Lone Star Ranch, and their children placed a simple stone marker that read, "Tabitha and Preston Nash." She ran for freedom, he promised his love, and together they built a legacy. The story of their love became legend in that part of New Mexico, passed down through generations as an example of what real commitment looked like. Young couples would visit their graves and make promises to each other, vowing to be like Tabitha and Preston, faithful, devoted, true. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy of all. Not the land or the money or even the children, but the example they had set of what love could be when it was built on respect, choice, and absolute devotion. Tabitha had run from a marriage with too many wives, and Preston had sworn she would be his one and only. They had both kept their promises, and in doing so, they had created something beautiful and lasting. Their story was one of courage and redemption, of a woman brave enough to demand more for herself and a man good enough to give it to her. It was a story of the Wild West, when the land was hard and life was harder, but love could still flourish in the desert like a rare and precious bloom. And it was a story that deserved to be told again and again, to remind people that real love exists, that it is worth fighting for, worth running for, worth building a life around. That when two people commit to being each other's one and only, they can create something that outlasts them, both a love that echoes through generations, a love that changes the world. Tabitha Russell, who became Tabitha Nash, had started her journey as a frightened girl in a ruined wedding dress, running through the darkness with nothing but hope and determination. She ended it as a matriarch of a thriving family, a woman who had lived fully and loved deeply, who had made choices and stood by them, who had demanded her worth and received it. Preston Nash had started as a drifting cowboy, moving from place to place with no roots and no real purpose. He ended as a devoted husband, father, and grandfather, A man who had found his home in a person rather than a place, who had given his heart completely and never once regretted it. Together, they had proven that love, real love, was not about possession or control. It was about seeing someone clearly, flaws and all, and choosing them anyway. It was about making a promise and keeping it through joy and sorrow, through plenty and want, through youth and old age. It was about being someone's one and only, not because you had to be, but because you wanted to be. And that, in the end, was everything.